Neurocareers podcast listeners. Today we are diving into the incredible world of trauma recovery and cutting-edge treatments for post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, with Dr. Deborah Beidel, Trustee Chair, Pegasus Professor of Psychology and Medical Education, and Executive Director at UCF Restores at the University of Central Florida. Dr. Beidel is a true pioneer in mental health, leading life-changing bench-to-bedside initiatives that blend groundbreaking research with a real-world impact. With over 350 scientific publications and more than 31 million in research funding, she is dedicated her career to transforming how PTSD is understood, diagnosed, and treated. Oh, welcome, Dr. Beidel. It's a great honor to have you today on our podcast, and we are looking forward to all the insights you can provide and to this amazing research initiative that you are providing to people with post-traumatic stress disorder, and also to the career possibilities in the field that is so important for many people who are listening us. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's great to be with you today, and thank you for that very kind introduction. I'm looking forward to talking with you.
Thank you. Dr. Beidel, can you please briefly give an overview of what are you doing right now, what initiative you are leading at UCF, and maybe several words about UCF itself, because people are joining our podcast from many different parts of the world, and it's so good to let them know about this amazing institution where you are leading your research and clinical program. So thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. UCF is in Central Florida in the city of Orlando, and it is actually a very young university. You know, we're only about 60 years old. And one of the reasons that I bring that up is because as a younger university, there's a lot more opportunity to do things that are a little out of the ordinary, right? Because it's like, well, we didn't do it that way in 1850. So it's like, so there's a lot of opportunity to really kind of spread your wings and try different and innovative things. It's one of the reasons that I actually joined here. It's now 17 years ago. I came in the Department of Psychology, but shortly after I got here, I got a call from the Army about some work that I had done with veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder. And they said to me, we'd like you to redo your study with veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan, because all my previous work had been with Vietnam veterans. And so I said, sure, let's do it. And that kind of started the career here and started UCF Restores. And unfortunately, tragic things have sometimes had a big impact on my life, as they do for most people. And working with veterans and active duty personnel, I woke up one morning in 2016 to hear that 49 people had been killed in the Pulse nightclub and another 53 were injured. And I got a call that morning from a fire department saying, can you come down here and help? And I said, sure. And off we went. And so that's how our work has expanded to include so many other populations in addition to military and veterans.
Yeah, thank you so much for this introduction. And we will dive more into different aspects of your work. But I want to start actually from your childhood, growing up. Can you remember yourself? What did you say to your parents? What did you want to become when you grow up?
I wanted to be a detective, and then I wanted to be an archaeologist. And so both of those things, when I look back on them now, were all about discovering, right? So detectives are about discovering what happened to someone or what happened at the scene of a crime. Archaeology is about discovering the past. And when I put that together, I realized that my career as a clinical psychologist has been about discovering new ways of helping people, new ways of treatment, new ways of understanding disorders, new ways that we can use technology. So that's where it started. And when I was 12 years old, I read my dad's psychology textbook because I was bored and couldn't find anything else to read, and decided that's the field I want to go into. So
Mhm. How did your career develop after you entered university and tried to choose your specialization?
I think that one of the things that I've always felt is that I've allowed my curiosity to sort of lead me to what I wanted to do. And so when I first got into psychology, I was working broadly in the area of anxiety disorders. And then started to listen to patients, even in graduate school, that I was seeing for treatment. And a lot of them kept telling me this had all started when they were a child. All their anxiety started when they were a child. And I realized that very few people were actually really looking at anxiety disorders in children, particularly social anxiety disorder. So I started to look at social anxiety disorder in children, and that, was a very fruitful field for me for a number of years early in my career. And then when I was at Penn State Hershey Medical Center back in 2006, I'd been doing a little bit of work in trauma at the time, but hadn't really done a lot. But that was the site of the Amish school shooting where that man went into the building and killed all those girls. And I was called in because I was the chief anxiety psychologist at the time. And that's really what started my real interest in trauma, which has driven the rest of my career. So I think being open to what scientifically is interested in and where your heart is, because I think research is far too hard to do even when you've got colleagues, but doing it alone and doing it in an area that you don't love is going to be impossible.
Yes, that absolutely makes sense. And I like how you emphasized that you let curiosity to lead the way. Yes, it was showing you where to go and you were going.
Mhm,
That's very inspiring. And also, what I noticed from what you said at Penn State, you said that you were a chief of a program. Yes, so you were leading a program where
mhm.
in leadership, which you are right now as well. It means that already from your early career stages, you possess those leadership skills. And not only that, you were willing to take on those responsibilities in leading roles. Do I understand this correctly?
Mhm.
That's my first question. And if so, what was your motivation? What made you go and take on those responsibilities? Why did you want to do that in the first place?
Well, my mom always said I was pretty bossy. And so, as the oldest of 5 children, there were a lot of other people to be in charge of. So, I guess I learned early on about being the one that was in charge. But I've always just been someone who kind of felt that I knew what I wanted to do and I wanted to take others along with me. So when I saw the opportunity to lead something, I wanted to do it. I love to build things in some ways, and that's really what a lot of being a leader is about, whether it's building programs or building people in terms of training. To watch something grow is extremely exciting to me. So I've always done that. And so I've not been afraid. I think another thing that's very important is when opportunities present themselves to not be afraid to take the chance. I'm a big Broadway musical fan, and I always think of that line from Wicked where Elphaba says, "Close your eyes and leap." And I think a lot of times that's what leaders do to get leadership positions and then to move forward. That if you think about all the things that can go wrong, you're stagnant and you have to focus on what you might accomplish. And, not everything works out, but everything's a learning experience. So that's what I've done.
Yes. And what you mentioned, I think is very important to remember to take on those responsibilities. Yes, to take that leap. However, not always we can see certain opportunities, not always they're presented to us. do you have also experience creating those opportunities for yourself? And
Mhm.
how did you do that?
I think a very recent one was when we started working in the area of trauma and we started to work with first responders as well. And the clinic that we had was starting to grow. I saw an opportunity to really make something out of what we were doing, to take what up until that time had been a research project and make this clinical research center. And so, with my fingers crossed and my heart beating fast, I went to the dean of the College of Sciences at that time, who was now provost, Mike Johnson, and said to him, I got this idea, and I'd like your support to try it out. And, he said, well, that sounds good. And I said, let's just see what happened. Let's see if we can make it work. And a couple of years later, we found out it was working and it was growing and it was growing. So I think, being able to think about what you want to do and I think have a clear idea. I mean, I didn't just go to him and say, hey, let's do this. I had a plan as to what I thought we could do and where I thought the money could come from and who I thought would be good to help me out and went with it and then just took a chance and went with him. And luckily I had a supervisor who was supportive and wanted to try it. So I think it worked out.
Yeah, that's, I think, a wonderful example of how we can create our own opportunities, to have a very clear idea, then, of course, to have a very clear implementation plan,
Right.
and then take that leap of faith, number 3. Yes, and yes, sometimes it plays out, sometimes it might not,
Right.
but we might have more ideas that we can explore.
It's funny. I tell my students there's a quote by Thomas Edison, and someone asked him how many times he failed before he invented the light bulb. And his response was, I never failed. I just know 9,999 ways that don't work. And so I think reframing that as not a failure, but a learning experience is really very helpful when you're looking at something that, there's always the opportunity to fail. But if you do it, it might work too.
Yes, absolutely. And do you have also those experiences under your belt that maybe things didn't go the way you were planning or the way you wanted, but you got experience that helped you maybe in the next projects? Maybe you can share just as an example for our listeners to encourage them how they can use those situations for their benefit.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I think grant proposals are a really good example and even just publishing a paper because I think in many ways, you spend a lot of time writing a grant proposal, and just because you think it's terrific, you may get to a review committee who points out like 20 flaws in it. And so, they don't like your work, they don't fund it. And I think you get a review, and it's always been difficult to read bad reviews when you put so much time into something. So I always just kind of put it aside for about a week until I'm less sad and less angry at the reviewers who obviously don't understand and then move forward and make the changes. And so I think those have been sometimes, and I won't mention one place. There was one place that I moved to and thought something was going to happen. And then there was a change in leadership, and the new leadership was like, no offense, but we don't want to do that. So they didn't fire me, but it was just clear that I wasn't going to get to do what I wanted to do at that place. And so I had to come to the conclusion that I needed to move again. And so I think those are things. Sometimes there are things within your control that make it so it doesn't work out. Sometimes there are things outside your control, and I think you have to be willing to face both of them.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And I
Mhm.
think all of us are going through in research, going through these processes. And yes, it's not easy, but like you
Mhm.
said, it can be accomplished.
And I think applying to graduate school is the same thing. Just because people don't get in the first time doesn't mean they shouldn't try again.
Mhm.
They may just need to get more experiences, beef something up, do a little bit more. But if it's something you really want to do, I don't think it's something that you should just put aside just because one person says no.
Yes, that's true. I think it's very important not to take things personally, that something is wrong with you. I think that's one of the biggest mistakes that people are doing.
Mhm.
So, yes, you might be missing certain skills that you need to acquire experience that you
Mhm.
need to get, but there is nothing wrong with you as a person, as a human being. Yes, and that you are not worth
Right.
something. Did you notice something like this with students that you
Absolutely.
communicate with and people that sometimes might have this
Mhm.
misconception?
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, I think after undergraduate school, I decided I wanted to take a few years off because I thought I could beef up my CV, get some more experiences. And so I took a few years off and I didn't actually go back to graduate school until I was 27. And so when I hear people now who didn't get in the first year and they're like, I'm never going to get in, it's like, hey, no, how old will you be in 3 years if you don't try and get in again? And the idea is spend that time doing something that's going to enhance your chances and also be open. Not everybody has to go to the same school or the school that someone says is number one. There's lots of places. And in the long run, what I tell people in graduate school is no one's going to hire you because you got all A's on your graduate school transcript. They don't care. They want to know what kind of research you did, what kind of experiences you have. And so I think it's a lot about not just your grades, but also those other things you can do to show what your skills are and to show what your talents are.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And as you started speaking about the grad school already, we have a question from Sudipta Mata. She is a UCF Neuroscience Alliance member, and she's asking, your career in clinical psychology has been highly distinguished, including leadership roles and groundbreaking research. What steps during graduate school and early career do you think were most critical to your success? And how can undergraduate students begin preparing now?
It's a great question. So thank you for that. I think that what I did in graduate school was I didn't want to miss any opportunity because I felt that maybe that was the one that was going to either really change things or give me a new experience. So I tried very hard if someone said to me, would you like to be part of this, to figure out how I could do it, even though I knew it was going to be a little more work. But I thought it was important to always stay open to what it is you did. When I started in graduate school, I never thought I was going to work with children. I was going for an adult oriented career. And then, like I said, when I got to part of my career where adults kept telling me, this has happened since I was a kid, this has happened since I was a kid, I'm like, okay. So now I have to start learning more about kids. And so I think that there are opportunities that people get very early on. I always think of what you're going to do as sort of like a funnel. At the undergraduate level, you should get as many experiences as you can. In graduate school, you may narrow them down a little bit because you need to get out of graduate school. Graduate school is not a career. And then, you funnel down more as you get out on your own and you have more ability to shape your own science. So you don't have to just do what your mentor did in graduate school or work alongside him or her with similar projects, but not really things that are very, very different. But I think starting out early and getting a broad range of skills not only helps you get into graduate school because you have more skills that people might be interested in, but also gives you a better idea of what it is you want to do and not just what you think you want to do.
Thank you. That's a very good suggestion to be open, especially during the undergraduate school. I think it's very important. I was speaking with UCF students, and some of them said that they even put certain hours for themselves to be on campus, to get exposed to as many experiences as possible, to really get the most out of that undergraduate
Hmm.
program.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And I think meeting with professors, talking about what their research is, and finding out what areas might be a match or might be of interest to you. So, unfortunately, we can't always take every excellent student, even who comes to us and wants to work with us, because we only have so much time. And I don't want to just have a lot of students that don't even really see me I want students that I can work closely with and make sure they get a good experience. So I think, again, not to give up. I think it's more important that people get good basic research experiences than that they've worked with X professor or Y professor or have done exactly what they think they want to do in graduate school because they may change. And when you're 20 years old, you don't quite know what you want to do with the rest of your life. So don't close yourself off. Uh,
Yes, and that's why we have two more questions which are related to what you just said. First, about those finding opportunities with the research mentors. And the question is, many students struggle with starting research projects as undergraduates. What advice do you have for finding research opportunities, approaching faculty mentors, and contributing meaningfully to ongoing studies?
It's a hard question, particularly at a university as large as ours is and with the student faculty ratio that we have. But I think approaching professors that you've had in a class, right? So, first of all, they know you a little bit better and you know them a little better. I think that's better than just a cold call or a cold email, I guess we call it now, from a student that we don't really know about. If it's someone that's seen you in class that knows your work, they're more likely to take a chance on you because they know who you are. And then I think, second of all, thinking about that person, the faculty member's research, and thinking about what you might do that's similar to, but still within their area of expertise so they're able to help you. I think that, for example, people who might come to me and say, you do work with first responders. I'm interested in working with nurses who are also a first responder. And then we can talk about, well, is that something we can do? And do I, as faculty member, have a connection with faculty in nursing? Might that be something we work out that then the student might be able to play a major role in? I think undergraduates doing research all by themselves is not really going to happen. I think doing it under the mentorship of a faculty member will make even an honors in the major project far more successful because you've got opportunities and resources that as an undergraduate student alone you don't really have. So I think those are things. But and I also just think, as I said, being open because you may not even know that you like something until you try it.
Yes, I think undergraduate program is a great opportunity to explore as much as possible and then find out what
Hmm.
you really want.
Hmm.
And you also
Yeah.
mentioned that undergraduate usually don't really know what they want, what research they want to do.
Hmm.
And here is another question from the UCF Neuroscience Alliance that is tied to that. The question is, how did you identify key research questions early in your career? And how can undergraduate students start developing their own impactful research
Hmm.
ideas?
I think that most of the research that I've done has come early in my career from also being a clinician who worked with people who had mental health challenges. And when you really sit down and work with people who have mental health challenges, you can start to see what the issues are. And then you can start to research around those ideas. So, for example, when I first started working with children with social anxiety or started in social anxiety, I wanted to figure out, well, social anxiety, a lot of that is about public speaking. Well, kids don't give public speeches, not little kids, like they were telling me. So I thought, well, what might be something that is also a fear of negative evaluation, which is what social anxiety is all about. I thought, geez, negative evaluation is when you don't get an A or a B on your tests. I wonder about kids with test anxiety, if they might also have social phobia or social anxiety disorder. And so my first study was just looking for kids with test anxiety and then giving them some interviews to find out about other things. And then that led to like doing a study about how many children with test anxiety also had social anxiety. And then from there, we're like, okay, we found a bunch of them. Now, what do we do? And how do we treat them? Because the adult treatments for social anxieties focused a lot on what you thought. But when I would ask kids, okay, you're really anxious. What are you thinking? They're going, I'm not thinking anything. I'm just really scared. And I'm like, no, but what do you think? I'm not thinking. So, what the kids were teaching me is that social anxiety looks different in children than it does in adults. And that leads to a whole bunch of other studies. So, I think it's asking the questions. It's also being humble as a researcher in some ways and being willing to learn from the people that you're around. And I think that a lot of times when people are looking for a research project, they're looking for a research project rather than just being open to what's happening around them and finding those things that could certainly be studied in a scientific fashion just by interacting. So I always think that doing good research happens and new ideas come about as a result of doing other research. So again, rather than thinking I have to come up with a specific research idea, it's more I have to work in someone's lab or do something that's related to people, in my case, with mental health problems. And from there, research ideas will come to you. You won't have to try and pull them out, they'll come to you. Albert Einstein said, genius comes when you're eating an apple. Right. So sometimes when you're not thinking about research, the best ideas will pop into your head.
Yeah, or when the apple hits a person on the head. Yes.
Right. Right. I always said sometimes my best research ideas came when I was exercising because my mind was someplace else and suddenly all those pieces fit back into place.
Yes. Yeah, thank you so much. And now I would like to get already closer to your studies in PTSD. Was this a part of your graduate research, or how did this line of research develop for you?
So it started actually more once I was a postdoc fellow. So right after graduate school, my mentor was a Vietnam veteran and was interested in working with veterans who had post traumatic stress disorder. So I was in some ways just kind of tagging along because it was really his deep interest. And then as we got further along into it and I moved to Pennsylvania when the shooting happened, that's when I started to become much more interested in doing research. But in those early years, what we found was that the treatments that we were giving to veterans with post traumatic stress disorder were not very successful. We really weren't doing it right and started to think about how to do it better. And thinking about a type of therapy called exposure therapy, which is used a lot with people with anxiety disorders. It requires you putting the person in contact with what is that makes them afraid. So, someone with heights, for example, we would take them to a high place, right? We could take them to the top of a building. If they're afraid of spiders or roaches, we could collect spiders and roaches and then have them like touch them or be in contact with them or whatever. But when you're talking about post traumatic stress disorder, how do you get people in touch with the horrific events that occur in war? And we couldn't recreate them. So the only other thing we could do was try to have people imagine them. And that sort of works, except for people who don't imagine very well. So that was kind of a challenge for how to get them. And that's what led to me coming here and the use of virtual reality in the treatments that we did. But it was really a matter of, once again, looking at the failures that we were having in therapy and saying, okay, what am I doing wrong? Because I never blame the failure on the person I'm trying to help, right? Because they're coming to me, I'm the expert. So I never blame the failure of the treatment on them. I say to myself, what am I doing wrong? Or what could I do better? And then that's what leads to developing something new. So it's been 25, 30 years that I've been working in some capacity with veterans, but have been more and more taking the lead as I became more mature and was able to do more things on my own.
Yes, thank you for sharing that. And I watched one of your videos. You were giving a lecture. It was video on YouTube. And you mentioned, which I think was very important career development step, that for some reason you were not able to get lots of support and funding with your work with PTSD with Vietnam veterans, and you even were considering switching to another topic. But then you were invited here, like you mentioned, and you tried it with a different population of veterans. And then things started changing for you. Can you elaborate more on that? Because I think that's very important to show that sometimes just small change might bring different results.
It did. With the Vietnam veterans, there had been a long history. The other thing you have to remember, and I'm old enough to remember when Vietnam was actually happening and when the veterans would come back, how they'd really be mistreated by the people in this country. I mean, people were spit on, veterans were called baby killers. And so Vietnam veterans really kind of pulled away. I mean, in the beginning, they were living under bridges, they were living out in the forest because they didn't feel understood by anyone, had totally detached from their families, and things were kind of stuck. And people were like, well, things are stuck. We don't have good treatments. Maybe they're just untreatable. But then the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq happened. And there was once again a push to try and do something. And I had published a paper for a grant that we did have with Vietnam veterans, had just moved down here to Orlando, which didn't really have a big VA at the time. And I thought, "Oh, okay, I'm done with veterans. I'm not going to be able to do anything. I'm in Florida. They don't really have a VA here." And I got a call from someone at the Army. And she said, "We saw your publication with Vietnam veterans. Do you think it would work with veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan?" And I said, "Well, I think it'll work better because it's not 30 years of people being disabled." I mean, some veterans from Vietnam I had worked with, they'd come to therapy, but they'd say, "But doc, I've been on disability for 30 years. If I get better, I'll lose my disability. No one will hire me." So there was this implicit understanding that they couldn't tell me how much better they might be getting because they couldn't lose their disability. But that wasn't the case with Iraq and Afghanistan because those were people fresh back. And so there was an opportunity to do something. But even then, the treatment that we were doing was taking about 17 weeks. So the Army gave me a grant. I said, "Here, just write your project." They gave me a grant. And after the first year, when I went back to report, because you have to go back once a year when you have military money and tell them what you're doing, the colonel pulled me aside and he said, "I think you've got a really good treatment," because we were doing exposure therapy with virtual reality. We were adding in group treatments for anger. And he said, "But it's too long." He said, "I can't have active duty soldiers out of active duty for 17 weeks. And I don't know, I just out of my mouth came, "Well, if you give me more money, I'll give you a shorter program." And he said, "Okay." And I tell people it's the quickest grant I ever got in my life because suddenly I had an extra $1.5 million and we developed a 3-week treatment program that has been highly successful with outcome rates that are 2 to 3 times what the VA was doing at that time. But again, people were telling me, "You can't treat PTSD on a daily basis," because that's what we were doing. They said, "You're going to get people so upset, they're going to die by suicide while they're in their treatment program." Well, that's a scary thing to hear, right? But I can tell you that having seen almost 1,500 people now using that 3-week program, no one has even attempted to die by suicide, let alone die by suicide. People said they'll be so drunk, they won't come drunk to treatment. Well, that doesn't happen. So I think, again, I knew that intensive exposure therapy worked for every other anxiety disorder. So why shouldn't it work for PTSD? I just had to be strong enough to close my eyes and leap and take that chance that science would prove me right. that doing it in an intensive fashion would work. And we've done it. And we've got great rates. We have low outcomes. The first time we did report on the new treatment, the colonel, same stodgy colonel, said, "Well, of course they're getting better. You're taking them down to Orlando, Florida." And I said, "Sir, we're not at Disney World. It doesn't look like the happiest place on earth where UCF is. It's a very nice place, but it's not Disney World." So again, I think you just have to do what your heart and your science tells you the right thing to do. But that's how we got into it. And the other thing I think is with young men who are more likely not to want to come to therapy than some other groups, using virtual reality was a good hook, I guess, an interest in getting them to at least come to the clinic, see what it was like, see that we were nice people and that we knew what we were doing. And once we were able to show them the VR and explain how it worked, they were willing to keep coming. But I think it was that technology, that innovation that was of interest to them because it wasn't what they thought therapy was going to be.
Yeah, definitely new technologies that are changing the way we're looking at
Mhm,
already historic treatment, known treatment.
mhm,
And also, we look differently at PTSD itself
mhm,
because there was so much research.
mhm,
And we also use neurotechnologies to learn
mhm.
what's happening in the human brain when they develop PTSD. Can you maybe define PTSD from the most current perspective, from what we currently know what it is?
Well, I think that we know that it's a disorder that happens after a traumatic event occurs. For most anxiety disorders, people are worried about something that might occur in the future, right? I mean, I can't go to a high place because I might fall off. But with PTSD, something has happened. And in many cases, something bad has happened. And I think that what it is, it's a failure to kind of process that in the brain. And when I talk to people about PTSD, so PTSD is actually a fear of the specific things that have happened that are part of that traumatic event. So, a very simple example is if you were at the Post nightclub that night and you were inside and you saw that horrific event, you may afterwards have flashbacks to that event if you hear Latin music because it was Latin night, if you smell tequila. And so post traumatic stress disorder is really, in many ways, the re experiencing of that traumatic event that's brought on by specific cues. And that's the most important thing to think about is there are cues from what happened because our brain stores things even if we don't know it's being stored, right? Your brain is taking in lots of information and we're only paying attention to part of it. But that is information is now in your brain and it somehow doesn't get stored as a long-term memory. It is in the front of your brain partly because the anxiety that is still there. And so we know that part of what we do in treatment is to help people process that memory and put it into long term storage. So I think what we know about PTSD is that it's not just people not able to tough it up, which is what a lot of first responders hear throughout their career. Oh, well, you knew what this career was going to be. If you can't take it, you should maybe get another career. It's not that easy. It's not that easy to see the traumatic events that our military and our first responders, and sometimes even just our general civilians see and think that people should be able to just walk away from that. We're human beings and so to try and process that memory and put it in a place when every part of our body is saying danger, 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 I think is really difficult. And because people can't process that event, they end up with horrible sleep problems. People with PTSD often sleep only 2 to 3 hours a night. They end up very angry and irritable because they haven't slept and they're always on guard, watching out for these particular cues. 4th of July is a good example. So many veterans actually hate 4th of July because of fireworks. It sounds like the guns that they heard. And so they can't enjoy what the rest of us enjoy because of the traumatic event and the memories that they carry around in their brain. So it's to me, it's it's a biochemical, emotional experience because certainly some people see those same horrific events and don't get PTSD. So there's something individual about people, but it's also something that it's hard to process in the brain because of the level of horror and trauma that occurs.
And you also mentioned that there are many other areas rather than military where people develop PTSD. We think mostly about veterans, people who came from Iraq, Vietnam,
Mhm.
but there are more people who are suffering from PTSD in other domains. Can you tell us a little bit more about other areas where people
Mhm.
experiencing that?
I think first responders is a good one. As you know, first responders will often tell me most citizens in general will probably experience 1 to 2 very traumatic events in our lifetimes. For a first responder, that might be a Tuesday morning, right? Because their job is responding to trauma. So, whether they're a police officer, or fire, or emergency medical services, we don't call them when we're having a good day, right? We call them when we're in trouble. And so I think that's a group until very recently, it wasn't really discussed. And they're a group that veterans have left the military. So for the most part, they don't go back and join up and have more military traumatic events. But first responders, even after treatment, are going to go back to the same job. So they're going to continue to have those experiences and those traumatic events. Another group, we think about people who are sexually assaulted. That's certainly a horrific event. And so that's another group that people have worked on new and different treatments than just to this more standard psychotherapy that used to be done maybe 40, 50 years ago. And now I think we see more of this mass shootings, for example. So we often get called to respond to mass shootings. I mean, I've responded after Pulse. I responded after Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. The FBI asked me to go with them out to Uvalde to talk to the first responders out there. And I think even within the first responder group, we don't think about people, civilians who work in law enforcement agencies, for example. Like I spent a lot of time in Uvalde with the crime scene investigators because they too saw pretty horrific things. And somewhat going back to your earlier question, too, one of the things we know about trauma and memories now is the importance of smell and the idea that, and I'm saying this to a neuroscientist, so you can tell me if I get this wrong, but from your olfactory bulb, that run goes right to the amygdala and the hippocampus. And so memories that are associated with smell can be very powerful memories and very emotional memories. And that's what I hear from a lot of people, law enforcement or crime scene investigators, when they respond to some of these horrific events is one person said to me, "I can't get the smell of blood out of my nose. I know that there's no blood right here, but I'm telling you, I'm smelling the blood." And I'm like, "I believe you." So I think that understanding smell is another part of really understanding PTSD because when I talk to people about that PTSD, they start shaking their heads. They know what it is to do that. And there's another thing with special forces. Special forces are another group that we don't think about that get PTSD because they're the strongest, they're the most elite in the military, but they too see a lot of horrific things which they try to punch down and not think about. And that doesn't always last or doesn't always last very long. So I think that more and more we're seeing civilians experiencing traumatic events because of what's happening. And if you think about the firefighters right now who are out in California, I bet none of them ever thought they'd be fighting a fire of that magnitude with the destruction that they're going to see and probably the loss of life that they're going to have to encounter as they go through and search through all those homes to look for people who might not have left.
Yeah. Yes, so much more. And as I know that you are also expanding your therapy to those groups as well. And maybe it's a good time to immerse our listeners into the therapy that you are providing. I also know that you are using smells because of their importance in the therapy. Can you guide us through this process, how this happens, how virtual reality is being used to help people?
Sure. If we think about the treatment that's been most effective for anxiety and for trauma, it is what we call exposure therapy. And as I said before, in the past, the two ways to do it were one was to take someone to a place that where their fear occurred or bring in spiders or roaches or whatever it was and do what we call real life exposure. The only other way we had was to have people imagine the scene. And I want to say very carefully right here that the idea of exposure therapy is not to get someone comfortable with the traumatic event. Therapy is not about trying to get someone comfortable with being sexually assaulted. But if a person can't go into their bedroom because that's where the assault occurred, I have to get them to be able to go back to their bedroom. And so I think exposure therapy is about those cues. And so if I have to ask you to imagine those cues, two things are challenging. One is, I don't know what you're imagining, right? I mean, I could be telling you to imagine this horrific event, and you might be too scared to imagine it. Instead, you're thinking about puppies, right? Something nice. So, as a therapist, you're not really getting the therapy if you're not able to imagine things. The other thing is, we can kind of imagine things visually. It's a little harder to imagine sounds and it's even harder to imagine smells. So, virtual reality allows us to create the traumatic event that happened to the person and to expose them to the sights, the sounds, and the smells that are the cues or the triggers for them and their fear. So you and I might experience the same traumatic event. You know, we might be at your house and we're having coffee and you're wearing a blue shirt and something bad happens. Someone comes into your house, breaks in, holds us at gunpoint, robs us, takes all of our money and our credit cards and leaves. The smell of coffee may then become a reminder of that horrific event. But for me, because I'm looking at you, or I was looking at you when this happened, the color blue may now become the reminder for me of the event. And the color blue may make me feel anxious, whereas for you, it's smelling coffee that sends you back to that event. So these are very individualized, what it is. And so I never tell somebody, here's the scene, here's what you have to encounter. I say, tell me what happened and tell me now what triggers your memories of this event, what happens in your nightmares. And so then we can develop the virtual reality scene. And then what we know is if we present those cues to the person and the bad thing doesn't happen again, right? Through learning theory, what happens in our brain is now processing those smells, those sounds, those sights, but that bad thing isn't happening. So your brain, through learning and actually even over learning, is making new neuronal connections in the brain, which we know is what happens. But those new neuronal connections are, to give it a person, are saying, just because you're smelling coffee doesn't mean you're going to get robbed, right? Or just because you see a blue shirt doesn't mean you're going to get robbed. We've learned that it happened once, but that it doesn't happen every single time. And what I tell people is, I'm not going to erase that bad memory. And actually, I have no right to even try to do that because that's something that is going to be there the rest of your life. But my goal is for you to not think about it every day, not think about it all the time, not have nightmares about it, to be able to go about your life. Yes, once in a while, that thought's going to come back to you. Maybe a day that it happened a year later, a reminder of that, but to get you to be able to get your life back again and to be able to live your life, I say, think of it like a filing cabinet. That memory goes into your long-term storage in the filing cabinet. You shut the door and you don't take it out anymore. So that's the individual part of therapy. But what we did with that is we added in this group treatment because exposure therapy alone wasn't really getting at everything. It wasn't getting at sleep. It wasn't getting at anger. So we developed a group treatment that was really focused on teaching skills. It was not a group treatment where everybody sat around and complained about their leader was a bad leader or this or that, the government. We heard a lot of that with the veterans, the government's problem. But we focused on sleep hygiene skills. We focused on anger management skills. We focused on something called behavioral activation for depression, which is a way of changing people's mood by having them do things and having enjoyment out of doing those things. And so that treatment together, packaged together, is what we are doing now in the treatment program and condensing it. We're doing 3 weeks. We find for some people they really only need 2 weeks, depending on what the trauma is. And so we're able to sort of give it like a multi-component approach. And the analogy I use when I'm talking to people in the community is you can think about PTSD as like a wildfire. Like there's a whole forest on fire. I could just go with a single hose, me alone with a hose, and try and put this big fire out. Or I could use 10 fire hoses, the airplanes, the helicopters, and just dump everything on it at once. And the intensive outpatient program that we use is the dumping everything on it at once. And we published the first paper in 2017. And now I'm proud to say there are centers all over the country who are doing intensive outpatient treatment. Not always what our treatment is, but people have now decided that the way to get a handle on this is through these intensive programs and that the negative effects just don't occur. That's what it is.
Yeah. Yes, thank you, thank you. So I was very curious, how did you reduce that duration of the program from 17 weeks to what it is now? How short is right now the program?
It's 2 to 3 weeks, depending on what people need. What we did was the original program was 17 weeks. The first 5 weeks were just exposure therapy. And then the next 12 weeks were just the group treatments. And it was like once a week for the group treatment. And the exposure therapy was 2 or 3 times a week. But what we did was to just say, we can do this in a compressed fashion. So then we did the exposure therapy every morning, 5 days a week for 3 weeks. We do the group treatment in the afternoon, 5 days a week for 3 weeks. People get homework assignments. And we were able to show that the treatment was just as effective as the longer treatment with a lower dropout rate and a low relapse rate. And so the idea that I always have is I want to do therapy until people's symptoms are reduced. And what we were finding was that after the end of the 3 weeks, people's symptoms really were reduced. And so we were able to collapse it in that way just by combining sessions. I mean, there was a lot involved in it because a lot of people can't take off 2 or 3 weeks from work. And so we had to think about, well, how are we going to do this? And then that led to thinking about, well, maybe we have to recruit nationally rather than or statewide, not just from the city of Orlando. And then that started us thinking like, where are people going to stay? And then we worked with a hotel who understood what we wanted to do and who would keep our confidentiality and who gave a very low rate. And the military paid for people to stay there for the first study so we could test it. And so people came at no cost. They came, they stayed at the hotel for no charge. They got their breakfast there, they got dinners there several nights a week. and we were recruiting from across the country. We've had people from 35 different states now who have taken part in our program.
Thank you. And it's good for those people who are listening to this conversation and they might consider joining your program.
We would love for them to come. We're working right now with the College of Nursing. There's a nurse there who is looking at something called post-intensive care syndrome, PICS. And what they find is that a lot of people, after they've been in intensive care, will develop a fear of almost anything medical. So they're in there, found this after COVID, the ones who were intubated but who survived developed a fear of sounds that sounded like the intubation, the smell of, alcohol cleaners, even just in some cases white sheets, the color white because of that frightening experience of being in the ICU. And so we're now using the VR system that we have to do a pilot study to see if the treatment is as successful. And the preview is yes, it is, with people with PICS. They don't need the group treatment because they don't have those other things, but we're doing it in the same intensive fashion and getting people from across the country because it's kind of rare, but we're getting people for a pilot study.
Yes, and thank you for mentioning that because I think it connects to that question of developing your research program. So there is a well-established program that you already have, and here is a person from nursing coming with your own idea about PICS. Can we apply it? And here is a development of a nice research.
Yes, it is.
Yes.
Oh.
Thank you. And as our podcast is often focused on neurotechnologies, I wanted to ask you a question about your implementation of neurotechnologies in your studies. I know that you were at least attempting to record olfactory evoked responses. We talked about the smell, and this would be an objective measure to see how people process the smells.
Yeah, and we found it's very interesting because it's easy to compare people with PTSD. In this case, we were using military personnel to people with no disorder, right? That's kind of a real easy thing to do. But what we were interested in what was there a difference between people who were in combat but did not have PTSD versus people who were in combat and did have PTSD? And we were doing it for both sounds and smells. And we did find some differences. They're a little more subtle than I thought, I hoped we would find. But we did find that, particularly when we use sounds that in the case of people with PTSD, it was part of their cues, their triggers. And the same sounds were things that people who were in combat recognized. That we found in certain areas of the frontal cortex, it was the part of the brain where anxiety would occur, distress would occur. And what we found in people with PTSD was that there was a stronger effort to kind of suppress that, to not hear those sounds, not smell those smells, although it was stronger with sounds, and that the evoked potentials were slightly different. Although, again, that was a study where I had smart neuropsychologists doing the work in that particular area. The goal of that was really to see if we could develop an objective profile that might help us distinguish people who really have PTSD versus people who sometimes say they have PTSD, but may not really have PTSD. And the one example that I can give is early on in the study when we were starting the intensive outpatient program, we had a young man come to the clinic and he's like, I have PTSD. I want to be in your study. And we were like, why do you think you have PTSD? He says, well, because people said to me, you're a baby killer. And I thought, oh no, that's the wrong war. You're not old enough to have been in Vietnam, right? But there are websites that will coach veterans in how to present themselves as having PTSD in order to get disability. And to me, that's a real disservice to people who really have PTSD. So what we were trying to do was to develop an objective measure of PTSD so that we'd have something other than just patient report as to what they were experiencing. We're still working on it. There's something there, but again, I'm not sure that for every clinician, they're going to be able to have tests of evoked potentials. So I would like to find something that's really simpler. But we did have different areas of activation in the brain between people in combat and people in combat who also had PTSD. So it's clear that something's happening. We just have to get better at making those discriminations.
Yes, and I think with the current developments in neurotechnologies, that's very possible.
Mhm.
I think even how we record and process and analyze evoked responses is changing dramatically. You even don't need so many lectures, only a few, and it can be just a simple cap. And you can analyze the data in real time and get those results in just minutes. So I think everything is changing, and that test will be absolutely possible. And maybe somebody who is listening to us right now already will start working on this idea and will connect with you. So that's also possible. Yeah.
I hope so, because that's what this is all about. It's about finding out things so that we can do best for people who need us. So that would be wonderful. Oh,
Yes. And speaking about technologies, we have another question here from Sudipta Mata. She's asking, your recent projects leverage technology such as virtual reality to enhance PTSD treatment. What challenges have you faced in integrating technology into clinical practice? And how do you see this field evolving in the next decade?
so what challenges we have? Well, first of all, I think we have to think about who the end user is because I think there are very smart people in technology who can develop very wonderful things in PTSD, but they have to remember that it's people like me who are not computer programmers and who are not really good with technology who are going to have to use this. So I think first of all, doing it with the end user in sight, right? And I think in a lot of cases, for a while, we were using goggles, the Oculus goggles for doing the treatment. They connected to the system that we have. But then Facebook, now Meta, bought Oculus. And in order to use their goggles, you had to sign up and get an account. Well, I've got HIPAA to worry about. I've got confidentiality to worry about. I can't be signing up on a Facebook app and having the possibility that that information gets out there with what we're doing. So that was a challenge of then trying to find another goggle set that would do the same thing that didn't have me have an account. The other challenges that you can have is like sometimes the systems can crash, right? So you're in the middle of a therapy session and all of a sudden everything goes blank. And so I think those are things that happen. The other thing is we really do find that the VR has to be fairly specific to the person's trauma. We had one person who said he was looking at the VR that we had that was the inside of a Humvee, and he kept saying, "This isn't going to work." And I'm like, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Those are Army uniforms. I was with the Marines. I keep looking at this VR and thinking, that's not right. That's not the right, you know." And so things like that where we have to think about how do we do that. Now, I think as technology continues to advance, it's going to be easier. And I'm hoping that someday there will be a system where developing a VR scene will be drag and drop or plug and play. You used to have to do all kinds of things to make your printer work with your computer. Now you plug it in and there it is. So I'm hoping that will happen. But I want people to understand that VR is not the treatment. A reporter from CNN one time was talking about Dr. Beidel does smell therapy. No, Dr. Beidel doesn't do smell therapy, but VR is a tool that makes the treatment stronger, more effective. And that's the way we have to use it. It's something that can help us do better, but we still have to do the treatments that we know work. We're always looking for things. Can we use apps? You know, are there websites? There's lots of stuff that we can do. Augmented reality might be another way of thinking about going for some of this. So my philosophy is I'm open to looking at anything that can make therapy better so we can get from 67% no longer with PTSD, 76% no longer with PTSD, till we get to where we have something that we really have gotten up to 99% that don't have PTSD, and then I'll retire. So,
What do you think about the use of neuromodulation? Neuromodulation becomes more and more popular,
mm,
and including PTSD treatment. So there is some research already going and showing promising results.
mm.
So what do you think about that and about potential opportunities integrating it into the programs like yours?
I think it's a good tool. I always believe there has to be like a whole lot of research around with things. We did a small study, a pilot study, the VR that we have, a new VR system that we put together. And we found that 14 out of 14 people no longer had PTSD at post treatment. Everybody's going, this is wonderful. And I'm going, no, it's a small study. We can't draw conclusions based on that. So I think that the neuromodulation has real potential. I would love to see a larger body of research around that, and I would love to see it with the hardest population, which again is veterans and military. They've been the part that's hardest to crack as far as PTSD. The success rates with veterans and military are still lower than with almost any other population. So I think that that's something that I think has lots of promise, and I hope it continues to be used and integrated because not everything works for everyone. And so some people get better with penicillin, other people need Cipro to get rid of an infection. So we have to have an entire toolbox that we can use for a disorder that impacts people as severely as PTSD.
Yes, and maybe objectively identifying those profiles with neurotechnology
Mhm.
and then providing treatment just for that specific group of patients or that specific
Mhm.
person,
Mhm.
which I think also AI development
Mhm.
is now allowing to do fairly quickly, but of course needs to be trained.
So it needs to be trained. A lot of these things we need to worry about, again, about security and confidentiality about those things. But I think they're there. I think they're wonderful tools. And I think that we need to look at how we integrate them and integrate them into what we know about the brain too. So that we use them effectively.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Beidel. And the last question from our students, UCF students. UCF restores combines research, technology, and clinical practice. What skills, experiences, or coursework should undergraduate students prioritize to prepare for graduate programs and roles that integrate these multidisciplinary approaches in research?
That's a big question. Again, I think that getting any research experience where you can work in where one can work in a setting where one is learning things about careful data collection, learning about inputting data into computers, learning about working with participants. So I think those basic research skills that the when I'm looking for graduate students, the population that they've worked with is less important to me than the fact that they understand psychophysiology and they've done work with heart rate variability, for example, or that they have done behavioral assessments. And so it's those kind of research skills, bench research skills in some cases, or even skills working with people. I think that's more important than focusing on a particular area like depression or trauma. I also think that clinical experiences are the same thing. Now, undergraduates are very rarely, if at all, going to get to actually be in charge of therapy. But we have students who work in our clinic who can participate in group treatment, for example. So they can be someone who might help out in parts of the group. We've had medical students who are interested in trauma come over to learn about behavior therapy and what we do and can participate at that level. Again, I think that it's the basic building blocks of what a good scientist is. Someone who understands intellectual rigor, someone who is not afraid to get their hands dirty, because I think that's most important. I say that if the first thing you do when you get your research project is you look around for who's going to do it, you're not ever going to be a researcher because no one's going to care about your research project like you do. So I think those opportunities, and I think not being afraid to start at the bottom. We have had one of my most successful graduate students started as an undergraduate research assistant with me, and her job was to look at videos of people who were doing certain tasks and make ratings of behavior. Like, was that person smiling when they did that? Did they use this kind of word? And I walked into her one day where she was working and I said, I'm really sorry. I know this is boring work. And she turned to me and she said, Dr. Beidel, whatever you want to teach me, I am here to learn. And I think that kind of attitude gets people very far in life because they show they're willing to work. They show they understand that those basic things are not grunt work or busy work, that they're important parts of science. And then I think when they do that and they're reliable and they always come when they're supposed to come to the lab, then I think they get more and more responsibility. And then they, in many cases in our lab, they end up as graduate students or they end up as full-time research assistants who want to do some things before they go on to a different part of a graduate career like medicine. So I think those are the things. I also think the opportunity to work in a medical school setting is really important when you're doing multidisciplinary research because you're going to work with people who have had very different educations, very different backgrounds. And I think that you learn a lot. So, the Neuroscience Alliance that you were talking about, I just saw an announcement for that in the building here. I think the opportunity for someone who's maybe a psychology major, but to go and work with someone in the medical school who's doing something very different but related, I think is the best way to begin to have that kind of career because you really cross disciplines and really parts of science. It's broader than just one field. So I think take summer opportunities. Sometimes a lot of professors are teaching pretty heavy teaching during the year, but they've got more time over the summer to work in research projects. And that might be an opportunity to work as a research assistant for someone. So I think that would be my advice.
Thank you so much. Very valuable advice. And in terms of this hard work, because yes, you need to get your hands dirty. You might be invited to many projects and you want to participate because you want to get as much experience as possible.
Mhm.
How to maintain that balance
Mhm.
with rest and relaxation in order not to get burned out? Of course, when we're still young, yes, we have lots of energy, but with
Yeah.
time it accumulates and then sometimes it leads to
Right.
not very good consequences. So,
Mhm.
from your perspective, what can you recommend?
I think it's important to not really accept more things than you know you can do because then you learn nothing and then you're not reliable and you're not able to do what you want to do. But I also think that you don't need to spend 4 years in one lab, that it makes sense to look around for different opportunities and see if you can negotiate, hey, can I do 1 semester here or 2 semesters? Because some people have sort of rules about how long they want to work with you because if they're going to invest time on the front end teaching you something, they want you to stay there longer than another couple of weeks. But I think it is fair to negotiate and to look around and to find different opportunities. If you're going to be in undergraduate school for 4 years, maybe start in your second year looking around. And those may be the smaller bits of work that you can do and then build up to other things and other experiences. And I also don't think that there's any problem with taking a gap year or 2 gap years. I mentioned that I actually had 6 years between when I finished my undergraduate degree and when I started again in graduate school. But I was doing a lot of research at the time, including running a funded research project. I was the project manager for some faculty. So I think that those opportunities, and there are some really good post baccalaureate programs now that exist that give people lots of good research experience and the opportunity to get on a couple papers before you go back. And I think if you think about people's careers are longer, people are living longer, their careers are longer, that taking the time to get yourself well prepared you're still going to have a long career. You're still going to be in the field a long time. So it might take some time to get some other experiences. I think the thing is to always just make sure that if you're going to take some time off, you're doing things that are really going to be relevant to your graduate career. So it's not just taking time off. There's nothing wrong with going to Europe for a while and relaxing or doing something else for a little bit of time. But I think to be constructive, and I think just think about what it is you'd like to do and what there is that can help you get there, and then go after it. And, I often tell students we don't have anything right now. If you're still interested in the summer or next fall, get back to me because by then we might have something or we might get a new grant, suddenly need people. So be polite, but you can be persistent. Say, hey, just check it in to see if anything's changed.
Yes, and some people are asking, how many times can I contact?
Hmm.
You're saying be polite, but be persistent. So people asking, 2, 3, how many times should I
Yeah.
contact a
Yeah.
person that it wouldn't feel too invasive, but that I still be able to follow up on things?
Right. So I would say if you contact someone and they say, we don't have anything available, I think an appropriate response might be, may I contact you again next semester or next fall to see if anything opens up? Most people are not going to be offended by that. What you get offended by is the person who contacts you every 2 or 3 weeks, like, hey, it didn't answer me yet, or hey, you said I could get back in touch with you, but faculty probably didn't mean 2 weeks later. So I would think to be respectful and I would ask, may I contact you again? And I think that's the way to do it. And I think if you don't get a response from someone, if you contact them 2 or 3 times and you don't get a response, you're either in their junk mail or they're just not interested in having you join them. And people want certain kinds of people. So because we do science, I'm less interested in someone who says they want a full-time clinical career as a clinician therapist because that's not who I want to train. And so I think making sure that what you want to get out of it is something that that person can do is very important. So match your interests to the faculty interests and be honest about them because otherwise saying you love something when you actually hate it just so you get a research assignment, that's not going to work. You're going to be unhappy and you won't want to go and do the work.
Yeah, that's true. Thank you so much, Dr. Beidel. What is the best way to learn about the things you do? And maybe there is an opportunity to contact you if there is a mutual interest or certain collaboration opportunities.
Sure. Our website is www.ucfrestores. It's all one word, no spaces in between F and R. So ucfrestores.com. And that will give anyone a good overview of everything we do and all the work that we do. And there's a contact form on there if you want to contact the clinic about something, or they can just email me at my UCF address, which is deborah.beidel@ucf.edu. So, but thank you. This is lovely to speak to you today and to speak to all your listeners.
Yes, thank you so much. Maybe there is something that I didn't ask you, but you wanted to share with our listeners, so that would be a great opportunity to do it right now.
I think, I can still remember being an undergraduate student. I can still remember in some cases wondering about what I was going to do, what I was going to be, and how I was going to get there. And I think the thing to remember is that you will. There are people out there who want to help you. There are teachers and researchers who want to train the next generation. And most of us feel that our legacy is not really in our papers, but is in the people that we trained, the people that go on to do something else. So I would say don't be afraid to ask, to participate in research, to speak to people that you think are famous. Um, and because they may be famous in what they do, but they're still people and they still want to have interactions with others. So don't be afraid. Be assertive about it. Tell them what you want and ask for their help. And you'll find that much more often the answer is going to be yes than no.
Thank you so much, Dr. Beidel. It's been a great pleasure and honor
Oh,
to speak to you today. I'm sure our listeners will appreciate listening to all your insights, and we all wish all possible success to you, to your program, and we'll be following up on the new developments. So thank you so much.
thank you.
Dear Neurocareers podcast listeners, thank you for joining me and my incredible guests on this exciting journey into careers in neuroscience and neurotechnologies. I hope you've been inspired by the stories of those turning groundbreaking ideas into impactful realities. If you are looking for more guidance on advancing your neurocareer, book a free consultation with me, Dr. K, your podcast host and neurocareers coach at the Institute of Neuroapproaches, the only career service dedicated specifically to the needs of professionals in neurotech. Let's take the next step toward your neurocareer success together. All this and more can be found at www.neuroapproaches.org. Again, www.neuroapproaches.org. Let's navigate the path to success in the world of neurocareers together.